Great, thank you. Well, thank you everyone for tuning in. I'm Grace Morgan, Director of External Affairs at the Taxpayers Protection Alliance. We're a nonprofit based in Washington, D.C. And today we're going to be talking all things tech, Section 230, privacy, with two experts in the field. Patrick Hedger is a research fellow at the Competitive Enterprise Institute's Center for Technology and Innovation. With a focus on internet and telecom policy, Patrick helps guide CEIs with commentary to detailed research and analysis. Jon Schweppe is Director of Government Affairs for the American Principles Project. There, he advances the organization's legislative priorities, works with allied groups. So yeah, we have two great experts with us today, and the structure is fairly open, but I think we're going to let each speaker give kind of opening remarks. So Jon, if you'd like to kick it off.
Sure. Well, Grace, thanks so much for having me, and thanks to this conference. I'm really impressed with having a 24-hour digital conference. It's such a cool concept, so I'm glad we're doing this. So, when it comes to tech and our approach to it right now, as conservatives, as libertarians, there is an issue with what big tech, the threat that it poses to liberty. And so there's three real issues that I kind of see as the issues of the day right now. Number one is that the public square has kind of migrated. So 20 years ago, 30 years ago, it was a physical public square. It was where, you go to a street corner, but now a lot of what we're seeing is migrated online. So with the new public square being online, with most shopping being done online, with our political debates, our even religious and cultural speech being online, that presents a new dynamic that we have to kind of consider. So that kind of informs the second one, which kind of concerns a lot of us, which is this concentration of power with a few multinational big tech corporations. And so the fact that Google controls 90% of search and 70% of ads, and Facebook is a place where most people congregate, and Twitter has an outsized influence on our news and the narrative of the day, and kind of how our political system works. These big tech platforms, to their own success, because they're great, they function very well. People love them. Network effects happen and people flock to them, but they've kind of gained this incredible influence over other things that happen in all across the world. And so that concentration of power wouldn't be a problem, and really wasn't a problem prior to, at least in my perception, 2016. But after 2016, when President Trump won here in America, we started to see a much more aggressive effort by some of these big tech companies to censor and otherwise remove certain types of political, religious, and cultural speech. And so, just some brief examples of it in America. President Trump announced last July that the White House had received more than 16,000 credible reports from users alleging they had been wrongfully censored or barred from access to digital platforms. In Spain, I recently talked with the Vox party, the VOX party. They're a minority party in Spain, but they do control 15% of their parliament there. And they are facing the same thing with these big tech giants, completely removing their ability not just to advertise, but to communicate with their adherents. So every major platform, from Google to Twitter to TikTok, has had these examples of removing speech. And the concern ultimately is, if they were small, if they were insignificant, if they were a comment section of some blog, I think most conservatives and libertarians would agree that's not really an issue if they remove the speech. But when they're market dominant, when they have this outsized influence on our overall dialogue, then there comes a point where these private companies do have public responsibilities. And I'm sure we'll get more into that. But the question then becomes, what do we do about it? And what can we do about it as conservatives and libertarians who believe in small and limited government? A lot of people have talked about the possibility of doing antitrust and breaking up these corporations with the force of government, or potentially instituting interoperability, or some of these other concepts. And I think a lot of conservatives and libertarians are squeamish to that, understandably, because we don't believe in government control of these of private actors. And so really we're starting to explore, okay, well, what do we have? What can we do to kind of influence this, to incentivize these platforms to act in a way that would promote a digital public square where speech and expression are valued? And we'll get into that in the talk ahead, but I think there's a few ideas as to how to do that.
Sure. A lot of great points made. I think that, Patrick might have a different opinion, so we can let Patrick kind of kick off his side and then go from there. Oh, Patrick, you have to unmute yourself.
Look at the wonders of big tech. Something popped up and told me that I was muted. So how about that? How about that for innovation? But then again, they could be listening to us. So we have to weigh that. But thanks, Jon, for that. I think you did a really good job. And I'm glad you are the one counterbalancing me on this panel, because I think you did a really good job laying out sort of a level-headed conservative concern with the power of big tech and their current content moderation practices. What I would love to point out, though, is that somewhere, probably sometime today or this week, there will be a conference a lot like this that's being held by progressive groups. And they're going to be talking about how they can force large tech platforms and services to censor more. Or to continue to constrain speech, because they're seeing a lot of speech that they don't like. And they want to use the power of government to influence big tech in order to constrain various forms of speech that they deem harmful. And what's nice, at least operating on this side of the aisle in general, is that we are able to kind of create that divide between seeing speech as speech and acts of violence as acts of violence, and not necessarily harmful. But just to kind of get into some of my opening thoughts on this, the role of digital platforms in addressing big tech bias, or tech bias is the name of this panel. And I really like the title of this event, because the answer to the latter question, addressing tech bias, is really dependent on the former. What is the role of digital platforms? If the answer to this is the myriad services we have today, everything from Airbnb to Zoom, which is predominantly and overwhelmingly a user-driven internet, there's very little that I think can be done about bias from a public policy perspective without creating serious problems with the legal protections to free speech, such as the American First Amendment. We have to remember that speech protections are ultimately about protecting the speech we do not like, but are also generally restrictions on government and not obligations on private entities. The online services of the world may not like to be associated with certain otherwise protected speech, and in turn, we may not like those companies' preferences. But for one of those subjective preferences to be protected, they all have to be protected. These rights to not be associated with certain speech are intrinsic to both speech and property rights. Now, if the answer to what is the role of digital platforms is a different kind of internet than we know today, even then, I have a hard time imagining how to address tech bias through public policy without creating enormous unintended and even worse outcomes, such as an internet that is nothing more than a digital version of the traditional and biased media outlets that we've dealt with for decades now, and that conservatives have rightly complained about for a very long time. Ultimately, I do not deny that there are problems of bias in content moderation. However, those problems will not escape us if we turn to government. This is a cultural problem and not necessarily a policy one, and here's a few reasons why. Most policy proposals to most problems, including this one, tend to become victim of what is known as the Nirvana Fallacy. And this is when you pit an imperfect status quo against a perfect government solution. And we know no such thing exists. In terms of bias by online services, everyone is biased. And one of the key insights that the public choice school of economics provided us is that even government actors, even when purporting to be unbiased, have a hard time not acting towards their own self-interests. And any American viewers, and certainly right-of-center American viewers, will remember that neutral law enforcement agencies, such as the IRS were subject to political bias. And I fear about expanding that realm into governing speech on the internet. Ending tech bias through public policy, therefore, simply means shifting the source of the bias somewhere else and perhaps changing the kind of bias. Now, of course, if you observe the political makeups of Silicon Valley and Washington, D.C., I don't think we're going to find much change in the nature of the bias. You're essentially going to be changing who ultimately is pulling the trigger in terms of taking down the content, but I don't think the kind of content that gets taken down would change much. Now, even if you are able to create a tool, ignoring some of the significant concerns with something like the First Amendment in the United States, that gives government actors the ability to set and police standards of speech, you have to assume that someday a political actor you don't like will get their hands on that tool, whether it's some of the things that Jon mentioned, like antitrust policy. Someday a hardcore progressive will get their hands on that tool, and they're probably going to wield it in a way that we don't like. And it won't be as simple, for as big as the platforms are now and as concentrated as the market may seem to some, the only thing more concentrated is the power of the government. And if you have a problem with the way those tools that we create to try and address perceived problems of bias, if you have a problem with those, opting out won't be as simple as deleting your account and going somewhere else. So that's my 50,000 foot view on this issue, and happy to get into the Q&A.
Fantastic. I think both of you obviously are rightfully experts in this, and you both presented a very structured, strategic argument. So just to kind of address, we're going to kind of dig in on a lot of different things you mentioned. And Jon and Pat, you both kind of touched on this. Tech, especially in the age of the coronavirus pandemic, has kind of proven essential. Obviously, whether you're using it to keep in touch with family, attend classes, or work remotely. With this in mind, could you kind of elaborate on what the role of tech in society is, and do you think that it has gone too far?
Pat, do you want to
Jon,
start?
if you have a thought?
I think tech obviously plays a critical role in society, and largely a great role. One of the things that's been exceptional about some of the problems we're dealing with today in 2020 is how tech is able to help us through that, connecting us, informing us, all these things. I think, sometimes what gets lost in the shuffle with the criticism of big tech from the right is, the idea that we're Luddites and we strongly dislike that tech is good or whatever. No, we love tech. I think the biggest issue is, we've actually seen that here in the pandemic. It comes down to like what kinds of speech is being removed from these platforms. So let's take coronavirus, for instance. There was a lot of skepticism of government responses to this pandemic very early on in March and April. And a lot of that was removed as misinformation or what have you from these platforms. Now, my biggest concern with that, and Pat mentioned this, and I thought it was a good point, is, when it comes to government doing that, that's very concerning. But we have these private market dominant companies doing it, and no one's electing them. There's no consent of the governed there. And so what happens is that when, Google and Facebook and Twitter, let's take that ridiculous pandemic video, okay? Obviously it was wrong and there was a lot of issues with it, but is that really the role of these private companies to do a complete blackout to where, people aren't getting that information in any way? And that's where I would be very concerned about that. I mean, there's way more innocuous examples than the pandemic video. I mean, there's people who were, expressing concerns in March that turned out to be true in May and June, but they were having their speech removed in March. So that's kind of, I think the tech is good. The companies by and large are good. At American Principles Project, we've interacted with all of them. I really do believe that in most ways they're acting in good faith. But that bias does have a huge impact on culture at large and society at large. And so that's where we're most concerned.
So in addressing sort of the original question, I think I could speak to something that caught my ear in Jon's opening statement. And that is this idea that the public square has migrated online. To a certain extent, yes, a lot of our political speech and a lot of our shopping and other things have moved online and have done so in quite an aggressive way, considering the COVID-19 situation. But what we also have to take into account is that the cost of creating these institutions has also plummeted as well. And the entry point is a lot easier as well. And so the question really becomes, and this gets to another problem that Jon spoke to, which is the perception that there's a concentration of power within tech. The question is that has that dynamism stopped? And are these companies truly invincible? And if we look at the numbers, despite significant market share in certain areas, and certain, it all comes down to how we want to define the market. Last year, Google actually lost market share in terms of the search market. Amazon began to eat into that, as well as Facebook. You have, and I think there are some certain issues that need to be addressed with TikTok, given some privacy concerns there, and where the company is based. But the fact that another platform, regardless of who was behind it, was able to really rapidly eat into the market share of social media companies like Twitter and Facebook is significant. And we're even seeing sort of a generational change away from, I believe it's the Gen Z now, using more video-based platforms like Snapchat. They've seen sort of a U-shaped recovery. So I want to make sure that we, before we jump in and say that we need to have some sort of public policy solution, the only thing that will completely drive dynamism in this market to a halt is creating a regulatory state that nobody else will be able to enter. And the companies that are big today will only get bigger if we put in place regulations that they are the only ones that are able to comply with. And this isn't just theory. We've seen this happen in the European Union with the GDPR, the General Data Privacy Regulations. While that was related to privacy, it still had a major impact on online services, including social media companies. It wasn't related necessarily to content moderation, but what we've seen is that Europe's already lagging tech sector, the market concentrations got bigger there. The big guys got bigger, and the little guys have all but disappeared. So as long as we can continue to see, and it's hard, nobody has a crystal ball, but it was not, I believe it was in 2007, there was an article in The Guardian that said something to the effect of, is it time to break up the MySpace monopoly? And I would just hope that someday, 13 years from now, we won't look that silly when discussing the current dominant market actors.
Absolutely. I've actually heard a lot of concerns about some legislation that's floating around Congress, where you regulate these big companies, and what happens to the smaller companies that want to innovate? They have no real reason to get bigger because they know that they would be slapped with more government regulation. And to that note, I would ask Jon, so conservatives are often, and those on the right are often champions of private property rights. Why now do you think that some conservatives are changing their tune with such a strong push for government regulation of tech?
So it really comes down to there's two rights that are competing here, right? You have the property rights, which are natural rights that everyone possesses, including the Facebooks and Googles of the world. And then you have a natural right to speech and expression. And obviously in the US, we get really hung up on the First Amendment, and it says government shall make, or Congress shall make no law. So we get very much that only government can't do it, but private actors can. And the courts mostly agree with that. So who am I to judge? But I think that there's these two natural competing rights. And, the biggest concern is, if you're an individual who has done nothing illegal and you said something out of sync with the mainstream online, but you still have the market still providing you a following or what have you, and then the 3 or 4 major platforms shut you down and destroy your livelihood or what have you, I think that's a real concern. And who elected them? There is no consent there. So that's what we're wrestling with, is that, and this is what I've really struggled with as well, is like, how do you balance these two very critical rights that we have to acknowledge everyone has? I think the key thing, and Pat brought this up, innovation is critical. Obviously, any sort of regulation or policy that would stifle entrepreneurs and these like small cap companies that are rising up to challenge the big tech titans, that would be a disaster. And so fortunately, with some of the legislation we're seeing in Congress, and I think this has kind of become more mainstream on the right, is that this needs to only impact the market dominant companies that actually have where they're so large that you can effectively make an argument that they're simulating the public square, right? Like where with Google, if you're a business, I'll try not to ramble too much, but if you're a business and Google shuts you down, doesn't link to your restaurant, takes you off Google Maps, et cetera, I mean, it literally could destroy you. And they're not a governmental body. They're not elected by the people in any way. And so I do think that there's a concern there. And that's where the antitrust people start to get freaked out. But that's where me, as, not wanting to get into that, not wanting to, impose heavy government regulation, I'd like to see the companies act on their own merits to see that speech and expression are critical values.
Sure. Patrick, do you have anything kind of to add or comment on that?
Yeah, I'm sort of reminded by the famous quote that's often misstated, but hopefully I'll get it right. But by Tacitus, the more corrupt the state, the more numerous the laws. And I get concerned when we start, especially on something like speech, which is so fundamental, where we start really breaking down the First Amendment into lots of little caveats, or any other speech protection into lots of little caveats, where you have speech and association rights so long as you have less than 50 million global users. That seems, one, to create these tiers of speech. I don't like this sort of Animal Farm style approach to fundamental rights, where all speech is free, but some speech is more free. And we have to remember that the actions by companies to limit themselves and limit their association with certain types of speech is fundamentally them exercising their own rights. So that would be my ultimate response to that. I just think we have to understand that the right to free speech is, we don't need to protect the behavior that we do like. And we may not like these websites removing content that is otherwise protected. But again, I also like to take an approach that is technology neutral. I mean, say we were discussing any other private business. Say I was to walk into a big box store holding a giant sign for any sort of given political cause. Just because they are a market dominant sales player, or a market dominant retailer, does that mean I have a right to be able to force my speech on their property? I mean, so again, as Jon mentioned, in the United States, it's the restriction, or the free speech rights are protected as a negative right, as restrictions on government, right? It's not a positive right. It doesn't mean that I have the right to put my soapbox anywhere and say whatever I want. So I think it becomes very difficult when you start putting, and dangerous, setting a precedent that you can put asterisks based on the size of your company. And when I mean the size of your company, ultimately, we're also talking about the success of your company. I do challenge the notion that nobody voted for the big tech platforms or the most dominant platforms because they didn't become dominant any other way besides people actually voting with their clicks and voting with their pocketbooks. I mean, that's a term that conservatives and libertarians like to talk about when it comes to competition, that if you don't like the practice of a certain business, you really should take your business elsewhere. And that, in a way, they are far more responsive to you than most political actors are, who are only up for a vote every 2 to 6 years, or and then end up delegating a lot of their power to completely unelected bureaucrats. At least at this point, for all of the faults of these major platforms, I do have the ability to, with a few clicks, completely opt out. But I can't opt out of the IRS as much as I wish I could.
Yeah, I think great points on both sides. It's obviously that specific topic of conversation, I think, is very nuanced, and it's something that a lot of people, both on, in all sides on the right and libertarian, kind of struggle with. I'm going to pivot to a question that was dropped in the chat from Ryan Young. He says the Section 230 debate isn't entirely about free speech. Some people on both the left and the right view Section 230 repeal as one weapon among many to use in a larger project against concentrated power. Is that a wise strategy?
Yeah, so I can speak to that. I think when it comes to Section 230, I mean, so we've been talking a lot kind of in the theoretical about should government be able to come in and regulate these companies in a way to limit their efficacy or whatever. Well, Section 230 is already on the books. And for those listening, I'm sure actually, I mean, we have very smart people at this conference, but for those who don't know, Section 230 essentially is American law that allows user speech as user speech. So the platforms are not liable for it in any way. So and it actually allows the platforms to remove the speech they want to. So there's two protections there. And the proposals in Congress and all that have said, well, look, I mean, this is the only industry that gets this type of immunity from civil liability. If we're going to provide this special benefit, why not, condition it in a way that incentivizes the type of behavior we're looking for, right? So, and that's done, with government grants, with subsidies, with that sort of thing as well. And I think there's a lot of merit to that. And when we talk about Section 230, as it is right now, it's completely, there's no conditions attached to it whatsoever. If you would amend it and change it to where these market dominant companies that really have an outsized influence on, our national dialogue, et cetera, and don't really give users any sort of option. I mean, the problem here is that, like, if Google doesn't, list you, if they completely delist you and deperson you or whatever, you're really relying on the 2% of society that uses DuckDuckGo or whatever, and you're not going to have any sort of impact. So I think Section 230 is a really interesting way to go at this because it's already a government special benefit that we're giving out, and so I don't see it as big government to necessarily amend the conditions for how we're distributing that.
Sure.
So I'll respond to that. And full disclosure, I believe Ryan Young, this is the same Ryan Young that's one of my colleagues. So, but I didn't plant that question, I promise. He came up with it on his own. He's very smart. But really quickly, one point on Section 230, to say there are no conditions is actually incorrect. There are parts of Section 230 that say very explicitly that if it does violate federal law, it is not protected. And that's even if the companies know about it or not, they can still be held liable for anything that violates federal law. And there's also now there've been added specific exemptions in terms of CSAM material or child sexual exploitative material. So there are things that the companies can be held liable for. And so it's not the blanket immunity that it often gets painted to be. But my other major qualm with the Section 230 debate, and there are even allies of Section 230 that would like to see it preserved, that I think make a mistake in saying that it is a special protection. In my view, it's a logical application of liability where it properly lies. Now, most people say, well, my gosh, the New York Times doesn't enjoy Section 230. No other traditional media publisher, you get this publisher platform distinction, which actually isn't in the law, but that's where the debate line is broken down. I just think that the internet, and the internet we know it as today, as a user-generated, a user-driven experience, is fundamentally different than any other industry that we've had. But that doesn't mean Section 230 is fundamentally different, because what you have are platforms that are essentially providing a service or a tool. And say you walk into Home Depot and you take a hammer off the shelves and then you go beat someone to death with it. Should you be able to sue the person that made the hammer? I just think that would be an inappropriate application of liability. And if Facebook provides a completely, or any other online service provides a almost completely open platform initially, unless you begin violating the rules, or their terms of service. And you start using it in a way that either they deem or the government deems a harmful or abusive way. Is that necessarily the fault of Facebook, or should we make sure that liability is narrowly tailored to the person that's actually using the tool or service in an inappropriate or illegal way? So that, and this is something that I think conservatives used to be for, and I'm confused when I see this push against Section 230 as sort of an unprecedented and unheard of subsidy or special treatment, when there's a long historical precedent of conservatives, libertarians, right of center folks trying to curb tort lawsuits, trying to curb frivolous lawsuits against people with deep pockets, because you can assume that they would be able to either just pay you off in court and make you go away. I would hate to see us, with a knee-jerk reaction against Section 230 because of the behavior of a narrow band of actors, such as the dominant social media platforms that are being accused of acting in a biased manner, and then end up upending the entire internet user-driven experience that we know, such as anything like Airbnb or Yelp. Anywhere that a user can create content is ultimately protected by Section 230, including the comment sections of some of the major dominant media platforms. And it really just comes down to, in my view, and as simple as when do you want to apply the filter on the content? When do you want to, because in comparing it to like a magazine or a television station or any other of the traditional media and they love to complain about Section 230 because they're the biggest competitors of the online platforms for advertising. So there's a little bit of rent seeking going on there. I can't just go to the New York Times and say, you must publish this. I've written this, you must publish it. Here, click a button, it's in your paper. But I can do that for Twitter or Facebook for the most part. And so if we want to preserve any semblance of the internet as we know it today, we're going to have some sort of intermediary liability protection like that. Otherwise, waiting, getting put on hold with some call center to pre-screen your tweet or your Airbnb post or your post to Etsy or eBay is just going to grind the internet economy to a halt. So I think we need to be very careful in using something that is so intrinsic to the entire internet as we know it as a blunt force instrument against a narrow set of what are ultimately cultural issues, in that we're seeing a broad erosion of respect for open speech and debate throughout our society.
Grace, I just want to respond to that real quick, because I thought Pat brought up a good point, which is that this is a logical application of liability to the users, right? And that makes a lot of sense. But I think that once you start having these companies selectively enforcing their own terms of services and removing some speech but not other similar speech because it's got a different political bent or a religious or cultural bent, I think that they kind of, in a way, I mean, obviously in the law as it's written, there is no, as you said, platform publisher distinction, but just in terms of what makes sense, I think they kind of forfeit that to a degree. Once they start selectively allowing some speech and not other, then they kind of endorse the speech they are allowing. And so I think that, obviously when it comes to the smaller companies, I think it doesn't necessarily make sense because, they simply can't. Well, number one, it is more like a private space. It's more like what Patrick described earlier, which is, you're entering a store with a sign. I think in that situation, it makes sense. But when you're talking about the big tech platforms that really have true market dominance, it's not really a big store as much as it's as if they owned, 90% of public sidewalks. And I think that's where it gets really concerning is, when these companies, which have such an outsized power, are able to consign ideas to very small parts of the internet and completely restrict them from the main part of the internet where everyone actually has the opportunity to see them and digest them and debate them. I think that's where it gets really concerning. And so I will say a lot of the conservative outlook on this is pragmatic. It's very much a concern of, I'm a social conservative. I have interest groups and people on my side of things that are very concerned that pro-life content, that belief that there's two genders, that these types of this type of speech is going to be increasingly restricted as we go into the future. And what kind of internet does that look like? That's not, that internet doesn't really look like this one either. It looks a lot more like, I would say, China's internet. And so, that's I think where we got to be concerned and be a little bit pragmatic and think about how to wrestle with these issues.
I would just like to briefly respond to that because the issue is that the definition of bias is extremely subjective because ultimately what the First Amendment protects is not just political speech. And the same protections that these web services have that allows them to disassociate themselves with political speech they may not like is the same reason you will have a very, very, very hard time finding pornography, terrorism related, and other violent content. It's not perfect, but they can be very aggressive in policing these things on the major platforms like Facebook and YouTube. And so, again, it kind of gets back to what I mentioned earlier, is that, creating these tiers of different protected classes of speech, where all political speech must be protected. I mean, who sets the definition of political speech, right? Then you're then assigning that responsibility to politicians. That's very dangerous, right? That's a very dangerous game. And then also deciding, what constitutes violent content. Do you then have the Tipper Gores of the world someday, future Tipper Gores of the world, saying, well, that means we're going to make sure that certain types of video games aren't protected. And so I just think it opens up a can of worms or a Pandora's box to solve what is a cultural issue. And again, it speaks back to my original point of the status quo is not perfect. But once you begin opening up the toolbox of allowing governments to set the rules of the road versus allowing users to set the rules of the road with their clicks, becomes very, very problematic. And you get a one-size-fits-all solution. And in that case, most people are generally very uncomfortable.
Yeah, and I kind of want to unpack this idea about giving politicians the right to, or the power to selectively choose what's political speech. Both Democrats and Republicans, and this was a question submitted in the chat by Billy Binion, both Democrats and Republicans want to reform Section 230 in very similar ways, but for precisely the opposite reasons. Republicans want less censorship, Democrats want more. In that vein, how can you ensure that the proposed reforms don't backfire when someone with a different ideology is in power?
No, that's a very good question. I was joking to a friend of mine on the other side of the debate on this the other day. If Biden is elected and we have a Democratic Senate, all of a sudden Pat and I are going to be on the same side fighting really hard to preserve 230 as is. So no, I think that's fair. That's why, ultimately, I really hate the idea of repealing 230 outright unless you have a very strong idea of what it's going to be replaced with. I think you have to do it all in one effort. So, the proposals that are going around Congress right now on the right generally support, like a First Amendment standard with regard to speech and expression. And for the market dominant companies, they would need to adhere to that standard to receive their immunity, with some exceptions, as Pat outlined earlier, but also like any kind of illegal activity. It basically would put the platforms in a position where if they thought they had a reasonable belief that some post was violating the law in some way, they could remove it and they would be protected. I think that's where we need to go with this long term. But yeah, I mean, the Democrats' ideas are absolutely crazy, and basically would create a ministry of truth where the government has total control over what content goes on the platforms. And, we really do have to be worried about that. And that's why conservatives who are arguing for reform have to keep that in mind, that the Democrats are not our friends on this. And they are not allies. We should not be allying with them, because what they want is really dangerous.
Pat, do you have any thoughts?
Yeah, I mean, I would actually echo in agreement with some of the things that John had to say there, that particularly the point on the Democrats pushing a sort of ministry of truth. You do see, I think it's important to address in a forum like this, where you have a lot of people saying, well, my goodness, why aren't Facebook and Google and all of these other companies doing a better job at determining what is true and fact checking these things? And the thing is, with political speech, it's all subjective. I could make a perfectly both true and untrue argument for you, depending on where you sit on the side, on either side of the aisle. I mean, a great example is, say I wanted to run a quick political ad or put up a tweet. I'm maybe, hypothetically speaking, in bizarro world universe, I'm running for Congress as a Democrat, and I put up a tweet that says, you know what, Barack Obama lowered the deficit. Okay, well, let's unpack that. The deficit went up under Obama, and then it did go down. But Obama, all of his budgets proposed the deficit to skyrocket after his term. But presidential budgets rarely go anywhere. Congress sets the budget, and Congress's budgets were the ones that actually brought the deficit down. But Barack Obama signs those budgets into law. So there's so much nuance in how our government works and how our politics works. And another great example, I supported the Affordable Care Act, therefore I support affordable health care. Well, there's a lot of documentation out there, a lot of research out there that suggests in some very important ways that that bill made health care less affordable. So it's really in the eye of the beholder. And the idea that, okay, if we want these companies to be less biased, then we should definitely not be trying to put them in charge of deciding what is and what isn't true in such a highly subjective area like political speech.
The one concern with this also, though, is that we do have a problem with this outside of just government. You're seeing right now a real campaign by Fortune 500 companies, by woke capital, to get Facebook to go with this kind of system where they would be fact checking every ad, basically allowing every Democrat ad and getting rid of every conservative one. And so this is a concern that, as Pat's used this word a few times, but it is cultural as well. And even if nothing changes on 230 over the next 2 years, we're going to have to be very vigilant in fighting against this effort by the far left and their allies in corporate America to really to limit speech and restrict our ability to express ourselves.
Absolutely. So we have another question that came in through the chat from David Williams. Do Twitter and Facebook, and I believe this was a question for Patrick, did Twitter and Facebook have a responsibility to present both sides of a political debate? They seemingly censored Trump on Twitter. Why not Biden?
Yeah, that's a great question. I would say it depends on their business model, depends on what they're striving towards, but any legal responsibility sort of flies in the face of the First Amendment itself. That's like saying Hollywood has a responsibility to present only once, both sides of the issue in any sort of political or cultural debate. I wish they did. But I also don't want to live in a world where politicians are empowered to force them to do so, because I don't think that Fox News should be forced to it should be forced to have a progressive or liberal counterpart to every one of their opinion hosts. Because again, it's about understanding that the tools that are being proposed here, to force some sort of new fairness doctrine is a very blunt instrument. There are no scalpels here. And again, getting back to Tacitus, the more corrupt the state, the more numerous the laws. I don't want to see us try and even go down the path of creating all sorts of little caveats and almost begin to centrally plan speech. I think that becomes very, very problematic. I already think that there are probably too many exceptions to the First Amendment as strong as it is. I mean, you have a lot of things, restrictions on various corporations and political donors and disclosures and things like that Democrats already want to make far more aggressive inroads on in terms of what a company has to disclose in terms of its product labeling. So the First Amendment, as rock solid as it may seem, is actually, it's weak in some areas. And I get scared about continuing to kind of pick open scabs to try and adjust things at the margins. I mean, we're living in a country right now where you have companies openly lobbying and of course I can't speak to our international audience, but there's great examples here in the US where you have federal regulatory agencies being captured and utilized by competitors in certain industries to regulate the advertising speech of their competitors. There is a great example of a company that makes hummus was trying to lobby, I believe it was the USDA, to change its legal definition of hummus so that all of their competitors could no longer call their products hummus. And so we already have these kind of threats at the margins everywhere. And I get concerned about then saying that there are new obligations for companies like these frontier companies like Twitter and Facebook. I would rather, protect the institutions that we have now that allowed Facebook, Twitter, Google, other dominant platforms to hit scale, because who knows? I mean, the next nerd in their dorm room is probably coding the next dominant platform that will supplant one of these today. And I want to make sure that they have the same competitive atmosphere to be able to do that.
Absolutely. Another question from the chat that came from Tom, which kind of ties into what you mentioned, Patrick, with the future of digital platforms. And, you mentioned before MySpace, and, thinking back to MySpace days right now, it's such a crazy time and such a time that I don't really want to think about. Why have there not been any successful conservative or libertarian competitors to Google, Facebook, Twitter? Happy to hear both of your thoughts, but why do you think nothing like that has really skyrocketed or taken off?
Yeah, I saw that question earlier. Forgive me for just jumping in quickly, John. I have kind of a narrow answer, so hopefully you'll indulge me. The reason for that is that, again, these companies are successful at scale. And there is not a very strong business incentive to create what ultimately is an advertising platform. It's what most of these online services are, or market platform. I mean, who would want to open a shopping mall that says, sorry, you need to show me your voter registration before you come in? That doesn't make a whole lot of sense. And on the flip side of that, I think you're already starting to see the sort of market reaction of companies like Google and Facebook, making an effort to reach out to both sides of the aisle and say, we want to accommodate you, because again, as I believe John mentioned, there's significant network effects here, and the broader the base of a user base, the more profitable and more valuable even to the consumer and the user that these platforms are. I mean, there's nothing very useful to any political candidate to be advertising to people that already are planning on voting for them. So there's not a lot of value for a company that wants to host political advertising to be looking to a specific audience. Now, I know you have examples of conservative media and libertarian media or progressive media sort of in the space of traditional media like cable and print. I think that's a factor of that you already started to see a significant breakdown of massive user bases or massive viewership bases. Magazine subscriptions are at an all-time low. Even network and cable news ratings are, yes, they may be getting millions of views, but that pales in comparison to what they used to be able to achieve when there were only 3 or 4 networks. So I think we're sort of, I guess, a good comparison would say maybe we're at the dawn of broadcast, the equivalent of broadcast television for the internet. And what that tells us then is that several years down the road, we can maybe expect to see more narrowly tailored sites and different types of platforms for various cultural or political or economic concerns.
So just 2 things to respond on that. Number one, Pat brought up network effects again. I mean, it kind of makes logical sense. If you're looking to get a message out there, you're going to go to where the people are. And so when it comes to, if there's 2 public squares in town, one where hundreds of people congregate and one where it's you and the squirrels, I mean, you're not going to go to the place with the squirrels. So, but the second thing I want to, that was a great analogy. The second thing
I like that. That was funny. Yeah.
the second thing I wanted to bring up, well, we have a squirrel that keeps trying to get in our house, so that was on my mind. I'd like to talk about the MySpace thing that Grace brought up. So, I like to compare this to Manifest Destiny. And for those of you who aren't American, this was kind of when we were the colonies, we were only on the East Coast of the United States, and we were kind of exploring westward, but there was all this new territory, and it was just impossible to say how the United States was going to develop in 1800. And the reason I make that comparison is that MySpace, came about at a time when the social media industry was completely an emerging technology. And now I think we've gotten to a point where we're more established, where Google, Facebook, we're all the way to the West Coast now. We added Hawaii and Alaska, and so it's going to be a lot harder for like a company that's brand new, something like Parler. Okay, so Parler has gotten a lot of attention in the last few weeks. People have moved there, conservatives only pretty much have moved there, but they're finding out really quickly, like, well, okay, this site kind of sucks because all I'm doing is talking to conservatives. And the whole point of social media and trying to speak and express yourself is to reach everyone, right? And so I think that's one of the biggest things with the build your own Google argument, is that it's really difficult to do that without directly taking market share away from Google, which is going to take a lot of funding and a lot of, you're going to have to build a much better product to do that. Where, back in the Wild West days of the internet, there was plenty of land to go out and move into.
Just to quickly respond to that, I worry that, I don't think any of us has the ability to see whether or not we've hit the Pacific Ocean or not, though.
That's true.
I get concerned that kind of thinking is similar to, I forget the exact year, but it was a very silly year for somebody to say it, that it's time to close the patent office. We've invented all the amazing things that could be invented. How could we possibly do anything else? So this is the problem with central planning broadly. It is once again, it gets back to the knowledge problem. We don't actually know how far the frontier extends out in front of us in terms of technology. And look where we are right now. How many of us had heard of Zoom 6 months ago? And now it is ubiquitous. Zoom entered a space that was already completely saturated, from Skype to Google Hangout, or I don't know all the exact terms, so forgive me, anybody, but the Google's platform or FaceTime, there's plenty of sort of video chat technology that was out there, but Zoom just was able to refine it and simplify it, and here we are. Here it's sitting in front of us. So, what I also get concerned with, what can happen, and Jon is correct that it can happen, where these platforms become so dominant. But the issue, what generally locks in an industry into a dominant position, is regulation. And I don't want us to see a point where the dominant platforms today, as much as I think they may be doing a pretty good job in a hard environment, can't immediately be unseated, where because they've hired the best lawyers to lobby the FTC and the FCC and any other legislative or regulatory body, are able to basically look at an upstart and say, well, see, their privacy regulations, their terms of service, their content moderation policies are not nearly good enough. You should make sure that they can't operate and challenge our market share. So that's where I get concerned, is where we create an artificial barrier to the frontier.
Sure. So we're running kind of low on time. So I just want to give both Jon, you Jon, and you Patrick, the opportunity for closing statements. If you have anything kind of short, sweet, to the point that you'd like to add that hasn't really been addressed today.
Sure. So real quick, I just want to thank you guys so much for this conversation, and thank you, Pat. Always a pleasure to talk to you. No, I think, there's a lot of talk about government regulation and what our approach should be from a policymaking perspective. But I think one thing that gets lost in the fray, where we can have an immediate impact, is pushing these companies to allow as much speech and expression as possible. And this is something I've seen Pat do on Twitter a lot, which I really do appreciate, which is, recognizing when one of these companies we can defend, I don't, but some folks might defend, 230 to stay as is. But if Twitter or Google makes a misstep and is obviously censoring speech in a way they shouldn't be, to correct them on that and to put pressure on them. There are companies in this space that are acting in good faith that I think are under a lot of pressure from the left and from other interest groups to censor speech and to really go after conservatives and religious conservatives in particular. But I think as long as we're speaking out against it and continuing to work with those companies, that's just really important. And so I encourage everyone listening who might disagree with me on 230 to continue to do that. I think it's a good model for us going forward.
Yeah, I'll just actually not a whole lot of disagreement there. But just to close, I think that really kind of gets at where I would hope this conversation goes, because again, this idea that we're going to have a public policy or any sort of legislation or regulation that's going to, one, not ultimately be subject to the political influences of political actors that may ultimately want to continue to limit speech. That's where the danger really lies. I think as far as just a cultural strategy going forward, would be for conservatives to continue to voice strong support for free and open debate, that there is a significant market for it, and companies will ultimately be responsive to the market. And I would find in the future that I think companies will be a lot more receptive to, if there is intrinsic bias within any online services, corporate culture, that they will slowly begin to recognize that, hey, one side of this debate is saying they don't want to crush us and they want us to be able to allow as much speech and as much content as we would like to have up. And the other side is basically trying to get our business taken away from us. And so again, it comes down to a natural, more cultural and market-based pressure to achieve ends versus potentially creating a policy or regulatory solution that has, I think, a very, very narrow window of not backfiring.
Excellent. Thank you both so much for joining today to have this incredible discussion. Thank you to the Australian Taxpayers Alliance also for helping facilitate the conversation. Patrick and Jon, do you have access to the chat? Because I think it might be helpful if you guys could drop your Twitter handles or something for people that are listening and watching if they would like to kind of continue the conversation with you on Twitter or elsewhere if they had some extra questions that didn't get answered. But yes, sure.
Yeah. Well, I can also add to that. We can leave this Zoom open if you guys would like to stick around, and people are welcome to ask further questions. I can unmute. You can actually have a more extensive conversation if that's something you would like to do.
Patrick, Jon?
Yeah, that'd be great.
I'll stick around for a few minutes. It is 5 o'clock somewhere, including here. So.
Yeah, it's quite early here. Yeah, and I would like to just thank everyone. Thank you, Grace, for moderating. Those were some very engaging questions. I came into this discussion without an opinion. This is a conversation that I've thought about, but haven't really been able to come down on either side. And I'm still mulling it over, but you have really given me a lot more to think about. And so thank you.
Oh. Thank you to our panelists.
Yes.
I think that you guys both provided a really good insight on both sides of the aisle. Well, not really aisle, but the debate on this specific issue, which is really helpful, I think, for a lot of our listeners who may not fully understand.
Yeah. And now the participants, if they would like, can unmute themselves and engage in the conversation.
No yelling.
No yelling.
And if you say anything,
how shy people are, that's the question.
Say anything against Hong Kong, Jon and I will both leave.
Oh yeah, that's
how we met.
We'll shut this down. If anyone says anything against Hong Kong, this Zoom is going down.
Absolutely.
Yeah, Jon and I met getting thrown out of an NBA game protesting for Hong Kong. So we do agree on something. That
was a fun night.
Yeah. One day my boss just came into the office and he's like, "Who's coming with me to Hong Kong to go protest?" My partner was like, "No, you're not going to do that." But two of our staff members went over to Hong Kong and joined the protests.
That's great. That's really great.
It's sad to see what's happening over there right now.
Oh, I can't even. Yeah. Ugh. Yeah. New topic, please. That was.
Yeah.
I know I brought it up, but it's heartbreaking.
If you guys want to keep it, I still have some questions. If you guys want to ask or answer.
Sure. Oh, fire
got a
away.
little bit,
I'll give it a 5:15 cutoff. How about that?
Okay, that sounds good. Yep.
5:15. Okay, so this was actually a question that was submitted by Billy, another question. I think it was for you, Jon. He said the Supreme Court has confirmed that pornography is protected by the First Amendment. How would reform proponents ensure that companies would have the right to regulate adult content as they see fit?
So Billy and I are probably going to disagree on this just a little bit, but he's referring to ACLU v. Reno, or Reno v. ACLU, which came down in '96 and actually struck down the Communications Decency Act, which is what Section 230 was attached to originally. It was a separate bill originally, but then it was part of the CDA. CDA gets struck down, 230 remains. So the Supreme Court actually did provide for a couple of things. Number one was obscenity laws are still on the books. They may not be enforced that often, but they are there. It's 18 USC 1460 through 1470. You can check them out. And also in the decision, there was the discussion of children under the age of 18, that there is a state interest in preventing them from accessing pornography. So the big issue with that decision was, you can't place an undue burden on adults that are seeking pornography, because that is a speech issue. But so with regards to kids, it's not. So I think the interesting thing here, and this is what I am excited to see, when you look at, this is going to get really in the weeds, guys, I'm sorry, but it's for Billy. When you look at Senator Loeffler's bill, so they talk a lot about illegal activity, basically being an exception to C1. And I think that obscenity would fall under that, or at least you could challenge it. And so what really would make that interesting is if that's the case, and say a class action lawsuit is filed against Pornhub or what have you, and say it was successful, the platforms would be strongly encouraged, or incentivized, I should say, to start removing speech that they thought could be illegal, which would include anything that could be obscene. So I know that the argument has been that under the First Amendment standard stuff, that there would be a incentive for the platforms to keep pornography. I don't think that would be the case. But as Pat has brought up, and this is really important, we don't know. And I can say what I believe will happen and all that, but that's why we got to be really careful, because sometimes there are unintended consequences, and I do acknowledge that.
Sure. Patrick, you have anything to add on that, in that vein?
Yeah, I mean, the issue also is, apart from anything that could be considered or even marginally considered obscene, there's lots of otherwise horrible things that would not be. And I think back to one of my favorite films, The Blues Brothers. I hate Illinois Nazis. Like, if I would hate for any, under a First Amendment standard, for any of these platforms to have to play host to, and when I say play host, I mean, we're talking, they call it the cloud, but they're servers. These are physical computers that people have, and I would hate to, and that companies own, and I would hate for them to have to play host because of a First Amendment standard to hate speech. I mean, I know hate speech is not something that we define necessarily legally in the United States, but to the same extent that is, and you see it in other places, and there are very strong protections for that kind of stuff. But I would hate to put that obligation on any sort of private company that, I'm sorry, because you're so big, the Illinois Nazis are allowed to, host content on your servers. That seems problematic to me, and it's not something I'd like the government to be addressing. I would much rather see a broad legal protection for speech of all kinds, but have more cultural and competitive alternatives to deciding when and where certain speech is appropriate. And I think pornography actually provides a great example. There's nothing in the law that says Facebook has to get rid of pornography, but they choose to. But there are other web services out there that don't. So I would want to continue to provide a lot of options out there for when a parent is able to set their parental controls on their browser to know that there are certain places that are vigilant in patrolling for things like either pornography or hate speech or terrorist propaganda or even foreign government propaganda. There's something that we didn't really talk about, but it's an issue. It's an ongoing issue. Is the attempts of foreign governments to potentially interfere in our election. I would hope that we continue to have American institutions at the forefront that are able to limit the reach of things like that, and not be found in violation of the First Amendment or a First Amendment standard.
Sure.
No, those are all. Sorry to interrupt, Grace. Those are all really good. I mean, these are the toughest questions. That's why I kind of framed it as, I think it's the intersection of property rights and the ideals of speech and expression. Because nobody wants to defend Nazi speech. But and certainly, the foreign actors thing, I mean, that's a good point too. Like, as we've seen from Twitter in particular, they're very much happy to get rid of Russian foreign actors, not so much Chinese, we've noticed. So there's just, those are things we have to consider. And I don't acknowledge that it's, or I should say, like, it's not an easy thing to deal with, because I don't want to defend Nazi speech. But I don't know how you create a system where far left progressives in these companies are not connecting Nazi speech to conservative speech, which seems to be what's happening now.
And just a reminder, if anyone on the call would like to chime in and ask a question, just feel free to unmute yourself. I think we have just a few more minutes of Patrick's time here. So
I'm very, very busy, yeah.
Very busy man. I do have another question, if no one else will chime in, that maybe we can just wrap up with. Question kind of for both of you. I think it is a little bit targeted towards Jon, but I think you both will have different perspectives on this. Conservatives perform very well on social media, on Twitter, Facebook. President Trump, Ben Shapiro, and others typically take the top spots for the most shared posts on Facebook each day. It can also be said that President Trump utilized social media, whether it was Facebook Live for his rallies or Twitter. He used it very well, and it's can be said that helped him win the election in 2016. How do you think kind of regulation and kind of this conversation that we're having helps those on the right if they're already performing so well on social media?
So I think I mean that's a good point. And, I think one of the reasons why conservatives are so scared, and I mean, that's the best word I think I have for it, is that social media was a critical medium for us in 2016. The left is mostly captured almost every institution in American society. And this was one way that we could communicate with each other, and more importantly, with independent, open-minded voters. And so now as the left is really, and the left knows that, they know they lost because of social media in 2016. That's why we're seeing what we're seeing now. Because I don't really think it's in Twitter and Google and Facebook's business interest necessarily to remove a lot of the speech, maybe Nazi speech, like what Pat described, because advertisers don't want to be seen next to it. But really it's about political pressure. And in the case of Facebook, I mean, this is where we all need to stand up and really fight for them right now. I just got done talking to one of their guys the other day, but they are under an incredible pressure campaign right now from these far left leaning corporations to get rid of political ads altogether, or at the very least to impose some sort of fact checking thing. And so I kind of lost my train of thought there, but maybe Pat can save me.
I think that's actually a great point. That's why conservatives are so skittish about this issue, because we've dealt with decades of right of center voices being ultimately left out of the national conversation by objective news institutions. What I would say though is conservatives really need to be careful. I mean, I have to say, the conduct of Dennis Prager in terms of his relationship to Google and their subsidiary YouTube, it doing a lot more harm than good. We're talking about somebody that is crying censorship, that has over a collective billion views on his videos. And with that, and I just don't know in what world, without the tech platforms that we have today, that Dennis Prager gets an audience of 1 billion views. And what he was ultimately suing Google, he sued Google over, was that their AI filtering systems, and ultimately those then get checked by people, put his videos, some of his videos, not all of them, put some behind a parental control. Now, of all the people in the world that would want a parental control on YouTube, I think Dennis Prager would be the first person to advocate for that. His videos weren't taken down. You had to sign in and verify that you were 18. And his complaint was that therefore these videos wouldn't be available in schools. But it's, again, I really just would hope that conservatives, and I consider myself a right of center person, and even though John and I disagree on this issue, I think you can back me up there. I really worry about the cry wolf effect, and to Grace's point, when you do have somebody like a Ben Shapiro or Dennis Prager or any other conservative institution generating hundreds of thousands of millions, if not billions of views, it's not just people on the right of center that can see that. Liberals are going to see that as well. And they're going to say, what censorship or bias are you talking about? And that's where you sort of lose them in the conversation as well. So I think it's a nice point for me to close on, and I'm happy to give John the last word. Most proposals I've seen so far are blunt instruments to issues that were blunt political and legislative and regulatory instruments that require a cultural scalpel.
John, do you have any kind of last comments to wrap us up again?
Well, just to the Prager thing, no, I agree. Prager in particular, saying that he's been, and maybe he had some grounds. I haven't read that case, but he's not really who I'm worried about. Like, I'm much more worried about the average Joe Schmo who's starting a podcast and a YouTube channel and gets demonetized and downranked, and is never able to actually get that voice out. I think that's happening much more often. What happens is that when a high profile person like Ben Shapiro or Prager or one of these other guys like talks about like, hey, I'm getting censored by the platforms react to that because they have an audience and they don't want the bad press. But if you're, a small business owner or what have you, and something's happened, you don't have any sort of recourse. And so that's kind of where I'm motivated mostly. But look, like, I mean, this is where I've been very, the coalition I've worked with on trying to create this model policy for a First Amendment standard. We have been very careful because we're trying to create a policy that doesn't have, all of these accidental impacts. And I think as we go forward, I don't think that this is the final version of it. I think we need to continue to explore it. And it'll be interesting though, just to get back to it, if Biden wins and if the Democrats win, this is just going to be a totally different conversation next year. And we're going to be very, very worried. So we should definitely be vigilant in that regard.
Absolutely. Vigilant and open to hearing all sorts of different opinions on the subject. Thank you, everyone, again.
Yes, thank you so much. This was such an engaging conversation. Thank you.